Hello and welcome to Woe to the Planet. I'm here today because I wanted to talk about carbon footprints, and more specifically your carbon footprint and the carbon footprint of the things you might be eating. Now firstly I should start off with what is a carbon footprint? Now a carbon footprint is the amount of CO2 released into our atmosphere due to the direct activity of an individual, company, community, anything like that. So we're talking about individual carbon footprints today, and more specifically the food and the carbon footprint that leaves. Now food makes up about 30% of our carbon footprint, which is actually massive. I mean, it's just under 1/3 of all the CO2 we release into our atmosphere. Now you're probably wondering at this point, well, that's all very good, but how much CO2 should I actually be producing each year, or what number should we be aiming for? Now the actual figure that I've got is 2 tonnes. That comes from the Paris Climate Deal. And by 2050, the average person on planet Earth should produce no more than 2 tonnes of CO2. Otherwise, we'll enter climate change and the runaway effects, and we'll just get worse and worse and worse. So we have to reduce our emissions to 2 tonnes. At the moment, the average person on planet Earth produces 4.5 tonnes. So we're more than double what we should be at the moment, which is insane, really. In fact, some countries are so far off, it's phenomenal. Take the United States for an example. The United States, the average person produces about 16 tonnes of CO2 every single year, and that's 8 times off the 2 tonne limit that we need to be at. So we really do all need to get to work and educate ourselves on what we're buying and what we're eating and how that's contributing to our carbon footprints. Now what I am going to do to give a bit of comparison in this video is tell you that a car, well the average car anyway, travelling 1 mile will produce around 411 grams of CO2. So bear that in mind when we're talking about different foods and how much CO2 they're producing and giving up into the atmosphere, because that kind of gives you a rough idea of how polluting they actually are. So the first one we're going to start off with is a banana. Now, bananas are great sources of potassium, they're brilliant for athletes, they're brilliant for anyone in general, they're a very healthy food. In fact, they're classed as a superfood. But are they super for the environment when it comes to fruit? Well, reasonably so, yeah. Now, the average banana, I live in the UK, so obviously this is going to vary from country. You might have locally grown bananas where the carbon footprint's even lower, but generally around the world most people eat bananas which are shipped across seas, and the average carbon footprint of a banana is about 80 grams. That's not too bad, considering we've got over 2,000 kilograms until we get to our limit. But there are examples of fruits which aren't quite as eco-friendly. Now one of those would be a kiwi. Kiwis, depending again on where you are in the world, but on average a kiwi will carry with it about 150 grams of a carbon footprint. That's nearly double a banana. So you can either have 2 bananas or 1 kiwi for about 160 grams of CO2. I think my one tip with fruit and veg, just in general, is to try and eat locally. If we eat locally grown foods that are in season in our own countries, we're going to dramatically reduce the CO2 emissions that they produce. One example of this is apples in the UK. Apples are a fruit which are grown year round, but this time of year especially, they're on the trees now and they're growing in vast numbers. So eating apples right now means you've got a relatively low carbon footprint. The next one is a favourite of mine. It is coffee. Many of us around the world are drinking tea and coffee actually produce a very similar amount of CO2, so I'm going to group them together, but I'm going to specifically go on coffee because I love coffee. And more specifically actually instant coffee. Instant coffee has a lower carbon footprint than sort of barista coffees you'll get in your coffee shop, so that's a bit of a tip. But the average cup of coffee, a black cup of coffee, produces about 20 grams of CO2. Now that's not too bad really, considering that you might drink 3 or 4 of them a day, which is going to add up obviously over coming weeks and months. But if you drink white tea and coffee, so you add milk to it, that carbon emission, that footprint is going to go up to 57 grams, all because you added milk, and it's easy to see why. Most plant-based milks, a litre, will produce about 400 grams of CO2, so we're on about soy milk, pea milk, almond milk, oat milk, all around about 400 grams of CO2. They're actually very similar to each other, which kind of surprised me, to be fair. Whereas a litre of dairy milk will produce nearly 1,500 grams of CO2, which is why we have that jump. So if you do drink white tea and coffee, make sure to use a plant-based milk. Plant-based milks are actually really nice into your coffee. I've had people who have always drunk milk swap over to soy milk, which is what I drink, and they haven't actually tasted much of a difference. I prefer coffee with soy milk into dairy milk. I have dairy milk every now and then, it's very rare, and I don't actually like it anymore. So top tip, swap over to a plant-based milk and you can reduce the carbon emissions and the carbon footprint of your regular morning coffee or tea. The next one I wanted to talk about was a pack of crisps. Now, more specifically, Walker's crisps, or Lay's as they may be known in your country. For some reason in the UK, Lay's are called Walkers and the broad Walkers are Lay's. I've got no idea why they changed the name of the brand depending on where you are in the world, but specifically in the UK we have Walkers anyway. Now, one bag of Walkers is about 6 grams of CO2, and actually because that's so low, they do actually have a carbon emission sort of certification saying that they are working to reduce their emissions. In fact, Walkers or Lay's have reduced their carbon emissions by 7% in the last 2 years, which is actually quite a lot. And in fact, by doing it, the company saved £400,000 in the process, which is incredible really, because it kind of sets a precedent for other companies that if they get out there and they're reducing their carbon emissions, they can actually reduce the amount of money they're spending and earn more profits off it as well. That's how we're going to make the environmental movement a bigger thing, I think, is by making companies realise they can profit off being sustainable. If companies realise that, then we're really onto a win. Now, I think since I've given a good few examples of foods which are quite low in the amount of carbon emissions they produce when they are created, it's only fair that I give some on the top end of the spectrum and actually demonstrate how many miles you could drive in the average car for just 1 kilogram of this food. Now, the top one you're probably thinking is going to be beef. It's actually not. The top polluter in terms of food that you can eat, which shocked me, is lamb. 1 kilo of lamb produces about 40 kilograms of CO2, and for that you could drive 90 miles in your car for 1 kilogram of lamb, which is just incredible to think about really. 90 miles in a car or 1 kilogram of lamb. It really shocked me that was the highest one, because you hear a lot about beef and you don't hear much about lamb. So yeah, that was an interesting one to learn about. The second one down is beef, unsurprisingly to many of us. 1 kilogram of beef produces 72 kilograms of CO2, which is a lot. It comes in at about 60 miles in the average car. And number 3 is cheese. Again, no surprise, it's from cows. Dairy cows are very polluting in more than just CO2 as well. In methane gases, greenhouse gases, it really is negative to be eating anything that comes from a cow, just the amount of CO2 emissions that they produce and greenhouse gases they produce. But anyway, cheese is 13 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of the actual product itself, and you could drive about 30 miles for that. So that just shows really that plant-based items do dramatically reduce your carbon footprint. And if you think about it, you've only got 2,000 kilograms every year. If you're eating a kilogram of lamb every other week, or depends how often you eat it of course, that's 40 kilograms of that gone, and that soon adds up over, weeks and up to 12 months and a year. So it really shows how if you consider what you eat and you really think about it and you do your research, admittedly it does take a lot to get these figures and it's very difficult, and you've got to research depending on where you are in the world, because a lot of it is actual transport costs and etc. But I've linked a website below which gives a rough idea of some of the lower polluters that you can be eating, and unsurprisingly all the ones which are polluting are animal products and the ones which are lower are plant-based products. So that shows a lot for what we've got to do towards climate change. But it also gives a list of some animal products which do produce less emissions than sort of beef and lamb. So maybe you're not ready to go completely plant-based, that's completely understandable, but check out the list below and just see some of the animal alternatives that you could be eating. One example is actually chicken. Chicken per kilogram is about 6 kilograms of CO2, which is obviously dramatically lower. So if you're eating a lot of lamb, you're eating a lot of beef, swap it out for chicken. That is going to dramatically reduce your carbon footprint. So it's all about swaps that you can do, being sustainable and making those changes, because it's really going to make a difference. Thank you for watching this video on what a carbon footprint is, what your carbon footprint should be, and the carbon footprints of some of the commonly eaten foods and how you can reduce them. Do check out that link in the description below, because I found it really useful and I think you will too. I'll see you next time for another Woke to the Planet video.